Hi, welcome to Carousel. We're very excited here tonight, beyond the guests that I have tonight. The studio, we haven't been here in about 2.5 months because the studio has been retrofitted, and we're actually the first show to be in the new studio. So I thank Rich Turksani, who is the Cablevision coordinator for Cablevision, for allowing us to come back and doing all the work to retrofit the studio, and we thank Cablevision. My name is Scott Albertson. I'm your host, and my guest tonight is a gentleman that we have very parallel lives. And as the interview progresses, you're going to get that. Joe Corsello is our guest tonight.
Scott.
Thank you, Joe. Thank you for coming.
Thank you for having me.
And Joe is a lifetime Stamford resident, Stamford,
Right,
Connecticut.
that's correct.
And Joe has placed himself on the map not only as a musician, but also as a community person.
Right.
One who has truly served his community well, and not only as a musician, but he's a retired Stamford police officer. And that's part of our connection because we were both police officers at points and times in our life. So we welcome Joe to Carousel, and I'm very happy to have you here. And Joe, his musical history is fascinating because of the fact of not only his growth, but also who he's played with. So let's start at the top. We'll talk about music a bit. Let's talk about your dad. I guess your dad was the main motivating influence.
Yes, that's correct. That's correct. My dad was Anthony Corsello, and he was the original Hawaiian guitarist with the Sammy Kaye Orchestra.
Oh, my word.
And when I was just a little tot, we used to sit in front of the TV every Saturday night, and we used to watch my dad playing Tennessee Waltz on the Hawaiian guitar with the Sammy Kaye Orchestra. And that's basically what got me involved in music. Dad would have a lot of the musicians coming by on weekends and that kind of stuff. And the drummer would come by and say, listen, I found this old snare drum, why don't you take it? Or here's an old cymbal. And I was about 5 or 6 years old. So that's actually when I started pounding away, I think.
Isn't that something?
Yeah.
Because Joe, as a musician, is a professional drummer. And I don't know if I mentioned that.
Well, I own a set of drums.
Right.
I don't like to.
You own a set of drums, right. And you still practice,
And I still practice. Oh, yeah. Oh, it's practice. That's right.
But
Yeah.
Joe's lineage of being a professional drummer, musician, is quite astounding. All right, so we'll talk a little bit about Dad, talk a little bit more about your history and what led you, because you went to Rippewam in Stanford.
Went to Rippewam High
Berkeley.
School, and then from there I went to Berklee College of Music up in Boston.
Right.
And after about 1.5 years, I was asked to leave, only because as a student at 17 years old and a drummer, I did a couple of really bad things. And when I say that, I started playing like 7 nights a week.
Oh my
And
God.
I was going to bed at like 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning. That's when these clubs ran,
Sure.
till the last set started at 3 o'clock in the morning. So by the time I got home and back to my dorm or my apartment, I would miss either my first class or my second class,
Sure.
and would come rolling in around 10, 11 o'clock in the morning. But I was having a ball. I was playing at the Peppermint Lounge in Boston, and I got to meet some really great musicians. And I guess even at that age, my name started getting around a little bit, and I started getting all these calls from some really, heavy musicians. And ultimately what happened was after 1.5 years, they asked me to leave the college because I wasn't really college material. So at that point, I came back to Stanford, and I knew it was very close to me getting drafted. And that was at the time of the Vietnam
War,
conflict.
right.
And I knew the sergeant that was the recruiter in Stanford.
Okay.
And I went and I had a long talk with him, and I said, I guess I have to join because my 2S status is now going to be, 1A. And I said, and what happens now? And he says, well, you're going to be getting a letter from Uncle Sam, and you're just going to get drafted. So I said, well, what do you know how to do? And I said, well, you know what? I was in music college. I know how to play the drums a little bit, And I said, I would love to. Is there a band I could join? Besides having a rifle, could I have a snare drum or something? And he said, well, I'm going to send you down to Maryland, and there's a little field band down there. I want you to audition with them. And I went down. My dad took me down to Maryland, and I auditioned for the band. And I passed with 100, and I didn't realize it at the time, but the recruiter called me back, and he said, are you a wise guy? And I said, what are you talking about? He said, you got 100 on this test. And I said, well, I just went down and played a couple of things for the guy and read a little, of the music. And he said, you got 100. He said, you know what we're going to do? I'm taking you to New York City. He said, we're gonna get you into the Army band. And I said, you gotta be kidding me. And he said, no, no. So they took me down to New York City, and at the time it was Governor's Island, and that's where the band was stationed.
Okay.
And I auditioned for the band, and he called me up and he said, guess what? And I said, what? And he says, well, you got a 98, you gotta get 100. And he said, but they're upping you the 2 points because they need a jazz drummer in the stage band. He said, but the only thing is you have to join. He said, you're gonna have to serve an extra year in the Army. And I said, that's no problem at all. I said, I would really like that, knowing that I'm stationed in New York City,
Sure.
and I'm going to be doing all the Fifth Avenue parades and travel around the country, and we were doing recruitment for other musicians.
Okay.
And so I did 3 years with the Army Band in New York City.
Right.
Was asked to leave after 2.5 years, but this was not a bad thing. This was a good thing. At the time, I was very good friends with Anthony Trulio, who was a state senator in Connecticut. And he called and said that there was an opening in the Glenn Miller Orchestra, and he could get me out of the Army 6 months early if I would be willing to join the Glenn Miller Band. And this was with Buddy DeFranco. It wasn't Glenn Miller, who had been long gone,
He's passed
obviously.
at that point, yes.
I may look old, but I'm not quite that old. But anyway, so I ended up getting out of the Army 6 months early, and I went with the Glenn Miller Band with Buddy DeFranco. And that's where it all started, actually.
You know, there's an interesting story that I've learned being a professional musician in the last 7 years is Bucky Pizzarelli.
Oh, yeah.
The wonderful, world famous, if you will,
That's
guitarist.
Right. That's right.
I met Bucky about 3 years ago in the city, and I was talking with him one day, and at that point in time, I was doing a tune called Racing with the Moon.
Mm-hmm.
And he's like, wow, Racing with the Moon, man, I haven't heard that in so long. Come to find out, that was his first gig after he got out of the Army, Armed Forces in 1947.
Really?
He was in that band doing Racing, Vaughn Monroe. He was in his
Right,
orchestra.
that's right,
That was
yeah.
his first gig after getting
No
out of
kidding.
the
Oh,
Army.
I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm good friends with Bucky. I'll have to ask him about
He's like,
that.
Racing with the Moon, I haven't heard that in
That's
so
funny.
long.
That's funny.
Racing with the Moon. Don't quite sound like Vaughn, but that's all right. But point is that you all had those experiences to come out of the armed forces, and music at that point in time is really happening.
It was just
really
it was unbelievable.
Yes.
It was unbelievable. I had a calendar. I had a date book that was just, it was filled. Every single day was filled
Isn't that something?
between doing studio dates in Manhattan.
Sure.
I mean, 2 and 3 a day, going to this studio, going to that studio. At that time, I was the house drummer at Michael's Pub, which was over on the east side, and that's where Woody Allen would play on Monday nights with his Dixieland band, and from Tuesday through Sunday they had jazz there, and that's where I got to meet like the Joe Venutis and the Zoot Sims and Kenny DeVerne. I mean, it was unbelievable.
But then life for you took an interesting twist.
Life for me took a very interesting twist in about 1978.
Right.
Music was starting to move from New York City and going out to California. It's when the Johnny Carson show decided they were going to go out to California. Most of the studios in New York City were closing. The clubs were starting to really cool it with music. Something I could feel something in the air. Something was definitely happening.
Sure.
And at the time I was married and had we wanted to have a family, and I was very concerned because I was making a lot of money. I mean, I was with Peggy Lee, and that was the time I had done the 3 tours with Benny Goodman, and the money was like, it was rolling in. It was great. It was really nice. And all of a sudden, all that started to fall off.
Start to wane, yeah.
So I enrolled at UConn because I only had my music credits, and I don't know how many of those I had after being asked to leave after a year and a half. I went up to UConn. I spoke to the dean up there, and the dean of admissions, and they said to me, "Well, you could take there's certain courses you could take that are pretty simple. Where a sociology course. I guess everybody gets an A in sociology. It's all opinionated stuff, right?
Yes.
There was a psychology course. You could take that. Everybody gets that." And I said, "Great."
Sure.
So I took the 2 courses, and on my first night that I went into college, my professor was going to be the new police chief for the city of Stamford. His name was Victor I. Cizanckas, and he was from Menlo Park, California.
So you didn't know him because you were born and raised in
No,
Stanford?
I had no idea who he was. He was from Menlo Park, and he came out and he introduced himself to the class and started talking. And after about my probably 2nd or 3rd week, he started calling upon me for, I guess I was a little older than everyone else in the class, and he started calling upon me for, like, how would you handle this situation? Or if you got into a domestic dispute, well, how would you handle? I'm saying to myself, why is this guy asking me these questions? I don't know anything about domestic disputes. What's he talking about? And then one night after class, he said to me, "Are you available after class?" I said, "Yeah, why?" He says, "Well, I want to go down to this place, this pizza place, and we'll have a pizza and a beer together." He said, "I'd like to talk to you." And I'm going, "Oh, man, what's up with this guy, man?" So anyway, we ordered our pizza and we're having our beer, and he said, "You ever think about becoming a police officer?" And I'm thinking to myself, "Police officer? Let's see. I've seen juvenile court about 4 times." I said, "Are you serious?" And he goes, "I think you would make a great cop." And I said, "I'm 32 years old." I said, "What are you talking about, a cop?" And he said, "I think you would make a really good cop." He said, I've read your papers that you've submitted and everything." He said, "I think you would make a really good cop." And I said, I said, "No, I don't really think that's a good idea, no." So he kept harping on me for that whole year.
Sure.
And finally, a test was coming up. And he said, "Do me a favor. Do me a favor." He said, "Just take the test. Just take the test." And I said, "Well, first of all, there's an age requirement." I think it was 31 at the time.
Right.
And he said, "Somebody just sued the city, another candidate sued the city, and now they're going to move it. They want to raise the age. So don't worry about you being 32. I said, "Man, I'm really old to be a cop, And I went home and I spoke to my wife. I said, "Could you picture me a cop?" She goes, "Well, yeah, you're like a cop around here, And I said, "Oh man." So I took the test.
Okay.
And with my military points, they give you an extra 5 points or something.
Right.
I
Yes,
scored
they
a
do.
98.6. Which is, and I have the worst test taker in the world. But anyway, I saw my score and I said, "This is unbelievable, And he called me up, he said, "How'd you do?" "This is the police chief now, he and I are friends." And I said, "Well, I got a 98.6. He said, "Great." He said, "We're hiring 10. He said, "You'll be in the first
There you
group
go.
of 25 that they're gonna talk to for the police commission."
There's
So
the
I
door.
ended up being a Stanford
the
police
door.
officer for 22 years.
Exactly. For you, being born and raised in Stanford, so life for you now comes to, if you will, full circle, because now you're back in your hometown, in your
Right.
home city,
Right.
and you're actually now, and Joe went on with a very successful career as a police officer, retired in
Right.
2001, I think it is.
2001, I retired.
Right, exactly.
Yes.
And there, in the middle of all that, you started a program called Music Box, I think
Yes.
it was, right?
Yes.
And the whole concept was to utilize your music skills and your music knowledge and your music background and your talent for kids in the Stanford area.
What
right?
happened was the police departments were given grants, some federal grants, to start something called community policing.
Right.
And when I say community policing, it was they wanted to get so many police officers in that town to actually work within the community. So the new chief that came in, I went through 10 police chiefs in 22 years that I was on the job, but this one police chief was tremendous. He was a lieutenant colonel with the Connecticut State Police. His
Okay.
name was Tully, was his last name. And he pulled me in his office one day and he said, "I know you're in the detective bureau." I was working major crimes at the time. And he said, "But I'm looking to put so many officers in certain, the housing projects and that kind
Sure.
of stuff to work with the people." He said, "Would you be willing to do that? Would you bring like a group of guys down there and do that?" And I said, "I have the perfect idea for the community policing thing." I said, "I could teach music. If I could
There you
work
go.
with the housing department and maybe they can give me a studio and
There
I
you
could get
go.
and that's how it all came about. Yeah.
What I'd like to do at this particular point, in time in the interview is we have some photos, a montage we actually put together of
Oh,
Joe.
great. Okay.
And the photos will start out with Joe playing with jazz great saxophonist Sonny Rollins.
Oh, that was
who
recent.
I saw.
That's pretty recent,
I
yes.
saw Sonny down a bunch of years ago in downtown hall. Man, just blew me away. Blew
Yeah,
my socks
yeah,
off.
he's a
What
great-
a phenomenal musician.
And a great person too.
And to
Great man.
play with him must have been like off the wall. So we're going to roll the photos, and as we're going to continue talking, the first 8 photos of Joe playing with Sonny Rollins. Where was this taken? Do you remember where this?
This was taken out in California at the El Cerritos Performing Arts Center.
Okay.
Yeah, this particular video.
And this was Sonny, obviously on sax, you playing drums. Do you remember who else was in the band?
Yes, we had Bobby Broom was playing guitar.
Bobby Broom, guitar?
Bobby Broom. Yeah.
Wow, I saw him at Bottom Line a bunch of years ago. What a great
Really?
cat.
Great guy.
Yeah.
Great player. And
Yes.
Bob Cranshaw, it was a bass player. 'Cause
Okay.
Bob's been with him about 40-something years
Oh,
now.
my word.
Yeah. So Bob was playing, and Kamadi Dimizulu, who's an African percussionist, who was just tremendous. He was a ball to work with.
Oh, my
He was
word.
great. And Sonny's nephew, Clifton Anderson, was on trombone,
Okay,
and that was the band.
that's the band.
Yeah. Yeah.
Did you do a tour with him at
We
that
did a
point? John?
tour. Yes, we did a tour. We hit a couple of places in San Francisco, and then we worked our way down to Southern California.
Okay.
And that was one particular trip. But there was a lot of trips in between.
Working into the segue of your life, so to speak, this is your life, but really more the idea of utilizing your music skills, and also now with the idea with working with the kids. That's what we're seeing with the photos. So the sequence of photos we're seeing now is that with the summer jazz?
That's the summer jazz group.
Okay.
Myself and the bassist with the Maynard Ferguson Orchestra, who was on that Chameleon record and
Yes.
Live at Jimmy's and all those great Maynard Ferguson records, is Rick Patrone. And Rick Patrone and I, about 9 years ago, we started our own music camp in Stamford. And it was an offshoot of what we had been doing, like teaching privately and getting together with these different community, you know, with the youths and getting together with them. And what we decided to do was we went to St. John's Lutheran Church, and we asked them if we could have the basement and utilize that for a couple of weeks during the summer, and have the kids come in.
Sure.
And we started off at 19, and by the time we finished, we had 40-something students.
Oh my word! Yeah.
And
the word got out.
The word got out, and then 2 years ago, I was approached by the Palace Theater in Stamford,
Yes.
over on Atlantic Street.
Yes.
And they called and said, you know, we understand you have a successful music program going up at St. John's Lutheran, and it should be here. It should be in the Center for the Arts, you know? And I said, I never thought about it, you know, but you're right.
Sure.
And they said, would you be willing to come and do your 2 weeks here during the summer? And it was a real shot in the arm. It was the greatest thing, because the people in that theater are just absolutely tremendous. It's been, it was great. It was great. And it was great because now we're back to our 40 or 50 kids a year, and everyone absolutely loves it there. And that's that whole atmosphere, that whole theater atmosphere.
Sure. Yeah,
of who's coming in tonight? Oh, Dr. John's in tonight. Oh, how cool is
real
that? Or who's
performing
coming in tonight?
atmosphere. Yeah, sure.
Yeah, it's just great. Great.
So that is part of the arc of your life.
Right.
For anybody is, everybody's given certain gifts, some certain talents. And for any of us, it's really the idea to figure out what you're here for and why you're here, and utilize those gifts and talents.
It's a give back. It's definitely
exactly.
A give back.
So for you, it was the music that you started out with.
Right.
And then you went to become a full-time and then retired police officer. And obviously with the community policing idea, and that bore a whole nother concept and side of you, and then that led you to, after retiring, doing the summer jazz camp, which is what, and you're still doing it.
And I'm still doing that, and I still teach privately. There's a store, it's Connecticut Music in Stamford, and I rent space from them, and they're great also, because they're, when people walk in and say, gee, I'd like to buy a drum set, a teacher? Oh, Joe Corsello's in the back over there, so I end up with students that way. But, I don't get to see people that much. I mean, my thing is, when I'm on the road and I'm traveling, so when somebody calls me for drum lessons, which normally are just pretty much advanced guys that want to take lessons. I just have to explain to them, if you think you're going to see me every Tuesday afternoon at 3 o'clock, that's not going to happen.
Right.
And they kind of like that. They kind of like that.
Sure.
I've caught a little bit of guff from some mothers that have said, listen, I want my son here every Wednesday at 4 o'clock. And I said, well, I can't do that. And
you can't commit to that because of your playing schedule.
Yeah.
Which is terrific, because utilize that phrase again, as a working musician.
Right.
Unfortunately, you were talking about 1978, how the gigs started to wane and some of the venues started to close, or changing the whole energy level because of the economic scenario. Now that we're in the recession, a lot of venues have closed.
That's right, yes.
And it's harder and harder to find places to play. And also with technology as it is, now it's so easy for people just to plug in on a headset. Why do they want to go see live music? So that's changed the whole dynamic of us performing live. And it's still out there. You have to work harder to make it happen.
Right, and the worst part of it is, for me, well, I shouldn't say worst part, because I do play with one of the last remaining jazz legends in the world, which is great. I mean, when he goes out, everything is first class, and we play in front of hundreds of thousands of people, which is great. Which, before I forget, I have to tell you something, that I spoke to Sonny a couple of weeks ago, and he told me that he's going to be flying out to L.A. to do the Simpsons show.
No
and I
kidding.
said, the Simpsons? And he said, well, yeah. He said, what's his, Bart? Is that Bart Simpson? That's
Bart
the
Simpson,
father?
yes.
Yeah. Well, the daughter, I guess, plays the saxophone.
Okay.
So they're going to do a caricature of Sonny, and he's going to be giving her a saxophone lesson, which I thought was great. That's great.
That's pretty wild.
That
Good
was
for
great.
him.
Yeah.
Good
But I kind of feel bad for a lot of the kids that are trying to come up and they really want to get out and play, and there's really no places for them to play. And as you said, it's very simple for people to just go home and turn on the computer and play with their video games and it's really nobody goes out anymore.
No.
But the other thing I was going to say is the music that we play, at least the music that I play, I mean the jazz, is only 1% of the music listening population in the world.
I know.
You know, so it's such a small, minute family of people that listen to jazz.
It's a real
which
niche.
It really is.
It's a real, very
is.
limited niche in that
Yes.
perspective. I wanted to mention as well, Joe has a book.
I do have
So he's
a
an
book.
author as well, beyond the fact that he's a musician and retired police officer and family man, the whole deal. But he also has a book, so I wanted to mention this. You can talk a little bit about
Well,
that
that's
for a
great.
minute or two.
Sure.
And this is Modern Method for Jazz Drumming.
Well, for young rock and jazz drummers.
Okay.
And I did this book along with the principal percussionist with the Rochester Philharmonic. His name is John Beck.
Okay.
And I did this book in 1972.
All right.
And John Beck was the teacher of Steve Gadd and a lot of the heavyweight
Steve
drummers.
Gadd,
And
wow.
I used to go to Rochester for about 2 months at a time with
Yes.
Marion McPartland, the great jazz pianist.
Yes.
And we used to play a jazz club up there. And we used to actually spend 2 months at this jazz club. And I thought rather than just hanging around all day long and waiting to play at night and everything, I would I would go around and meet people at the college and stuff. So I met John Beck, and I explained to John, I said, I would love to do a drum book. I said, would you help me, think about how I can put this thing together? And at the time, there was a famous composer in town, Alec Wilder. You know Alec Wilder, right?
I know of him. I mean,
Yes,
I know.
yeah. Well, Alec Wilder used to hang around with us all the time because he had an apartment up in Rochester.
Okay.
And I spoke to Alec Wilder about it. And I said, Alec, I would really love to do a drum book because there's so many. I mean, you could line, from your front door to the moon with drum books. There are just a million drum books. But I said, I want mine to be different. I want it to be different. And we devised a system of not having to count in certain situations.
Okay.
And, the books that I use are like, you start a new student off on whole notes or half notes or quarter notes. And the next page is like, all of a sudden, it's like something out of like, who the heck wrote this? Are you kidding me? I can't play that.
Right.
This thing is like very slow and gradual. And you can get into
It builds
actually,
into it,
yes,
yeah.
right. And
So
by the time you finish the book, you're actually out playing. So
Okay.
it's a great
so
book.
It's a sequence of steps to actually help you move
Right.
along
Right.
with learning methodology.
So there was a lot of time and effort put into it because then my second trip to Rochester, I actually had to go up there with a little portable typewriter. Does anybody remember what a typewriter is?
Yes,
But it's
an Olivetti.
Olivetti,
Yes, blink, blink, blink,
yes.
blink, blink. Yes,
Yes,
exactly.
Yes, and so I went up there with my portable typewriter, and that's how I spent my days, rather than just going out and hanging out with everybody else.
Sure.
I just sat in my room, and this actually took a couple of years to put together.
And a wonderful constructive way to utilize your time. And
Yes, yeah.
as well, pass on what you've learned. Pass
Right.
on your gifts and your talent.
Right.
Couple items before we get too close to the ending here. First of all, if you're interested in Joe and where he's going to be playing and watching his videos, he does have a handful of videos on his website. Also, you can find information on the book on his website. The photos that you saw in this interview are on his website. It's joecorsello.com.
Right.
And also, Joe is in this issue of this magazine.
I only brought that because I have so much fun with that issue. That's
I know.
it. That's the
'Cause it's Vanessa
owners of
Williams.
Con Air Corporation in Stanford, who was a very good friend of mine, Lee Rizzuto.
Okay.
And he called me one time and he said, I would love to do a story about you. And I said, a story about me? He said, yeah, I have this magazine. He said, could you send me some stuff about yourself? And I said, well, I don't know why you would pick me. Oh, I saw you play. I would love to do a story
Sure.
about it. So anyway, so they did
So
the
there is an
story.
article
The
in here,
magazine comes
yes.
out, right? So
Yes.
now when people want to do an article on me, they say, can you send us some PR stuff? And I said, sure. So this
There you
one I sent to, there was a Modern Drummer magazine, which is like the #1 drum magazine in the country. Everybody subscribes to this magazine. All the drummers anyway.
Sure.
And they called me up and said, Joe, can you send us some stuff, some recent stuff? Now this has been out probably 2 years now.
Okay.
But this was 2 years ago, and I sent them the magazine.
Okay.
And the magazine, if you look through it, is all these actual, I mean, there's beautiful women in
Very,
here,
very
there's
pretty women,
models,
yes.
and yeah, very pretty women in here.
Yeah.
And my story is like in the middle here.
Yes.
The story is in here. And it actually has me selling a hair product here, which I thought was kind of good too. That was kind of good. And did I get any free hair product? No.
No.
But I did. But the funniest story was I called Modern Drummer and I said, did you get my magazine? He says, yeah, we got it. I said, did you like the story? He says, what story? never got the joke.
Right, never got past the cover, right? And also, you mentioned before we started rolling this interview that you have another interview coming out in Jersey Jazz Magazine, right?
Yes, yeah.
And that's going to be coming out soon.
Jersey Jazz Magazine should be coming out this month.
Okay.
Yeah,
So
and
that's
the minute
coming
it
up real
does, I will
soon.
definitely send it to you.
Okay.
Yeah, definitely.
Also, for people who are tech-oriented, so to speak, you're hooked into computers, you can find Joe on Facebook. Very simple, Joe Corsello, because we're friends now.
Right.
And I met Joe a while back, but I was at a restaurant in Stamford called The Fez last week, and Joe was doing a gig there. Man, that was a great gig.
Great.
You guys were
and
slamming.
the owner there, Eric, is
Eric seems
just
like
a great
very,
guy.
very neat guy. Yeah.
And it's one of the few clubs that has music like 6 nights a week.
Yes.
I mean, he just has, you know, and maybe some nights 2 and 3 bands a night.
Sure. Yeah. So
You know, he really very, very supportive of music and jazz and
It
rock,
seemed
and
it.
no matter what kind of music it is. It's
seemed
a
it.
Mediterranean, I guess, menu.
Yes.
But the music is just everything.
Yeah,
It's
you could
everything.
see because he was so charged.
Right.
First time I was ever there, you could just get the vibe from him and see how so charged he was about
Yes.
not only you playing, but just the music as whole.
Right. Right.
We're getting close to the end of the interview, so I wanted to say to you that I brought you something here from a local bakery because it's Joe's birthday in a couple weeks.
Oh, that's right, November 11th.
That's right.
What'd you bring me? I said cannoli.
You were close.
Oh, it is a little
you,
cake.
So
How
you can
great.
take that home.
Thank you. Look
I'm
at
not going to light it because they'll freak out here and send the fire department.
Thank you so much.
So
Wow.
that's for you, and a early happy birthday.
Thank you.
And thank you for coming on and being a guest. And I think at some point in time, in the real near future, we're going to work that out. I think Joe and I are going to be performing together.
Wouldn't that be great?
We've talked about that.
That would be great.
And it would be an honor to share the stage with you
It
and
would
make music.
it would be an honor for me.
And it'd be a
Yes,
hoot
definitely.
and a half. It'd really be a hoot and a half. We'd have a blast.
Definitely.
Yeah, be rocking and rolling. So,
Thank you, man.
JoeCorsello.com.
Thank you.
And also, thank you again to Rich Tersani for allowing us to be in this new studio. And it's all been revamped, upgraded, and all brand new and spanky, and it's just really terrific. Check our website, lifeonthecarousel.com. Thank you for joining Carousel. Please join us again. And thank you to Joe Corsello.
Thank you, Scott.
Good night.